All right, let's talk about the dark, how I used to be afraid of it, and how it's one of the most powerful tools for people to have breakthroughs in their life. And on today's podcast, I have a dear friend, a man that I admire deeply, who is a walking embodiment of everything that he teaches, everything that he preaches. And he has single-handedly touched, inspired, and been the catalyst for more close, successful people in my life through what he facilitates than anything else. And those are darkness retreats, things that I've been interested in for a long time, dancing with, have done short ones, and keep being called to. But my mind was blown on this episode, like beyond his articulate nature, his manner, his experience, how he walked the walk for himself for so long before ever doing this, his desire and drive to help people in humanity from children all the way up to the oldest of adults connect with themselves and know how to integrate things. And the wisdom is profound, like it oozes out of him. And so we talked about darkness retreats, like what they were, how they offer a profound emotional and spiritual journey, allowing individuals to confront and explore their innermost experiences, how the experience of safety and fear in the darkness has a profound impact on the emotional and spiritual journey of people, how the evolution and refinement of darkness retreat experiences continue to shape the way that individuals engage with their emotions and spirituality. And we talk about how to manage one's experience in the darkness, including, and I think one of the most massively beneficial, is the exploration of fear and surrender. And it's a significant aspect of a darkness retreat journey. And the experience of darkness exposes vulnerability and brings forth deep emotion and senses, which is what it feels like to be alive. And this is one of those episodes where I forgot to ask questions. I was so devoutly listening and inspired and touched by what was shared and called to it that I just had to get this episode out. And I'm going to have Scott back for another episode because I have hundreds of things I want to ask him. And really, I just want to hear him speak because I feel like it's a walking fortune cookie of wisdom that we can all benefit from. And so without further ado, I won't yap any longer in the intro, but I cannot wait to hear your feedback of this episode. And just so you know, I love you. Have a good day. Enjoy the episode. Let's get into the show. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Mind of George show. And yes, this is still George. I might sound like I'm going through puberty. I might lose my voice. It will be squeaky. I will be leaving all of it in because I just got back from an incredible men's weekend with my dear friend, Evan. And quite awesome is that there's a few things that I experienced this weekend that we're going to be talking about today. And so today I am beyond incredibly excited. Today's guest is a gentleman, a scholar, but an incredible man. And so many of my dear friends that I respect, I admire, have also been in his world and done work with him. And I am a man of intrigue, and I love it because this man has walked the walk, has done the path. And for every time I think I've gone deep into my practice, all I have to do is read his bio and realize how much time he's dedicated to the understanding and mastery of self, and now genuinely creating his life in a sanctuary to serve other people using all these tools that he has created. And so for me, I can't think of a better introduction to be like, well, when I was a kid, I was afraid of the dark and I never thought it would go away. And now this man's job is leading us into it to love it, enjoy it, and find the best parts of ourselves. And so, Scott, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me, George.
Oh, dude, I love it. I wish we could record it in the dark, but it would be like one of those dining experiences where you can't see your food and nobody would know what's happening. So, I do want to set context for everybody, and I'm going to ask you like a very basic question because, this is something that I'm uber familiar with, and I've been exposed to darkness retreats, for probably like 6 or 7 years now. But for everybody listening, can you kind of just break down like what a darkness retreat is, what the purpose of darkness is, and even maybe your personal experience with it?
Sure. So, a darkness retreat is where someone goes into a completely black space where your eyes don't adjust to see your hand in front of your face. And our caves that we built in the hillside are quite soundproof. And so, there's also this element of not hearing sound. And some people, when they first hear it, it's kind of just like, so you're just blind. Like there's a bit more than just not having your sight. And as we get into this, we could unpack that more of just the nuances of what happens when you're in a dark retreat, why, and how it is much more than not having your sight, not having sound. Um, there's so many elements in there that bring someone into what they come into and what they confront. And so ours, they're in the hillside. There's a little double door where we pass through food, like a little cabinet door. There's also a hot bath, flushing toilet, sink, place to stretch out, a foam roller, a yoga mat, a zero gravity chair. There's the bed. There's a little table on the ground to eat food. It's about a 300 square foot room. And Dark Retreat is an ancient practice that dates back through so many different cultures. There's the Kogis in Colombia, where they're through the process that culture had, youth as little babies were chosen at birth to be the sages of the culture, and then they went into the dark with their birth mom and the elders. And my understanding is they'd go in for 7 to 9 years, and that at times they would come out into the moon and the stars, that they didn't see the sun for those 7 to 9 years, and a majority of that was spent in the dark. And then there's in Dzogchen, a branch within Tibetan Buddhism, the dark retreat practice it's more of a secret practice. And for the practitioners who are devoted their life to that exploration within that tradition, and they work their way up to a 49-day dark retreat. They have specific practices that they're doing. And then there's different lineages in India, in Tibet, in China, all over. And I recently just learned of the Aboriginals in Australia that they had a dark retreat practice. That was different than the other ones. As the one in Australia, it was more for the average person. Like in Tibetan Buddhism, it was like you were practicing for a lifetime. With the Kogis, you were with the elders and you were chosen. But with the Aboriginals, it was the tribal doctor could prescribe a dark retreat for someone if they were going through difficulty, if they were disconnected, if they were sad. And then there was a whole process of how they found the cave, who supported them. And so that was more for the everyday people in their culture to go into the dark and explore what was there. And it wasn't necessarily within the framework of a specific practice. And that's kind of how we hold it here, is a somatic orientation where there's a real returning to and anchoring in your body. And there's not a technique, a practice. There's not necessarily a cultural overlay in achieving of spirituality, if you will, in a movement to be other than you are, to transform, to awaken, to heal, to manage your experience. It's more this uncovering in being in what's exposed when you really release control. And so there's that element of, a lot of us now are familiar with cold plunges, and there's fasting and vision quest and like doing hard things. And yet the darkness is a completely different exploration in that, as there's nothing to control. Like there's something when you do hard things and you just like are pushing through and enduring, which many people do in the dark because just of our conditioning to, like, when we're confronted with difficulty, to kind of buck up and beat it and overcome it. And yet in the darkness, that tends to, that quality of bucking up to beat it, to overcome, builds a lot of pressure, because there is no release of pressure in there. And so it really exposes the level of resistance that we're in. And for someone who's really willing to be honest, it exposes our expectations. It exposes our ideals and our romantic ideals about how we're supposed to be, how the journey's supposed to be, and all the things that we cover, where like anxiety, fear, guilt, shame, pain, anger, sadness, like those are definitely not it. They're certainly not spiritual emotions. They're not even like great worldly emotions. And the ways in which we look away from that, because it doesn't really confirm our worth, and it certainly doesn't bring us any points in the world. And so there's this journey in the dark of what happens when we're no longer managing our experience, when we really lay down inside and are just simply and tenderly with what we're feeling in our body. And it's a lot easier said than done. And
Yes.
it's amazing to see all the ways in which we turn away, and like our nervous system's function is to keep us safe
Yep.
without us knowing that we're insulated. So it's amazing, like so many things that we all do that we actually don't even know is a protective mechanism so that we are safe from overwhelm and from things that, for whatever reason, we've pushed down because they don't really foster connection necessarily, more on the surface, but they don't necessarily foster connection in the world. Like if you're sad and in the world, you might not get lots of points, and people may, there's almost a pulling away. And so what we do when we're actually sad, and the layers we built on top of it, that we actually come to a point that it's hard to even access our sadness or really authentically let it move through. And the
Yeah.
ways that we insulate in a sense of purpose, the way that we insulate in a sense of power. Like if we didn't have a purpose, which is like, part of how the world brings us up, and almost how New Age spirituality lifts us up, is like having a great purpose and manifesting your dreams and like just getting after your soul mission and your purpose. And not that there's anything wrong with that. And that exploration of, does that insulate us from the simplicity, from like the real genuine connection with being nothing special? How do we insulate in power? How do we insulate in purpose? And those ways that then cover what's really underneath that.
Yeah, that was poetry, brother. Like I have so many things happening in my body right now because of the years of me being in this, but that was poetry, and I'm going to choose a thread to start with because this lands at a very deep level for me, and I actually just got out of practice 24 hours ago in a similar practice leading to that surrendering to moment and removing the insular layers as we get there. And it was magical in a lens because I was there completely content, completely happy, like everything was great, and through a practice exposed this depth of grief that I'd never felt before, that I thought I had felt and experienced, but I came into it through joy. But then at the bottom of that full feeling, there was this surrender. And that's the word that I hear underneath like all of this. Like, I love how you describe darkness as not being a peak experience, an exposing experience, right? The more that you can drop in or settle in. And it was insane to me because and this was in my own personal practice, I was curled up in the fetal position in a ball, like weeping and sobbing like I've never wept before. And within 3 seconds of the bottom, the most and the only word I can describe is orgasmic joy and uncontrollable laughter that I have like ever felt. And it was like there was this switch where I was like, surrender. Like it was just this like all the way in. And that's what darkness reminds me of for me personally. And so I have a question about you personally, because like you did your first darkness retreat like 13 years ago, right? And so were you already in work, like had done vision fasts or, Vipassana on, any of those, or was darkness kind of your way in? And like, what was that like for you?
Mm-hmm. In about 2004, I began spending a lot of time alone. I had like
Mm,
there was a heartbreak, and then that kind of um, brought a lot of despair, and then I kind of retracted from the world in my like protective mechanism to like insulate myself. I didn't see it that way then. And then I got turned on to spirituality, which, when I really look back on my journey, my movement into spirituality was a cover for my pain and my grief,
Yeah.
that for whatever reason of what I was in or the support I didn't have or whatever it was there, that I wasn't able to actually process and be with the overwhelm of the heartbreak. And so I turned to spirituality, which then I never saw it this way then, but probably a good 18 years in achieving spirituality as an unconscious cover for my pain and my grief. But
Yeah.
I never saw it that way at that time. And so I started spending a lot of time alone. I discovered Southern Baja in 2006. And there's this place up in the mountains there, this oasis where the water just flows year round. And there's hot springs and waterfalls, and there's no one up there. And so I spent, over the course of 7, 8 years, I spent a couple years up there. And at a certain point,
Wow.
my wife joined me, and we would spend 3 to 6 months. We'd spend our days alone, come back together. And then one of my last long stints up there, I was 40 days up there. My wife dropped me food way up the canyon, so I didn't see her or anyone. So I was 40 days alone. The last couple of weeks was fasting, and I loved meditating, screaming, shaking, singing, chanting. In the early days was definitely got pretty proficient at bringing myself into ecstatic, blissful states for hours and hours through chanting and singing. And I'd sit and meditate 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And then
Wow.
in 2011, 2012, somebody mentioned a darkness retreat to me, and I was like, oh, that's right up my alley. I love the exploration and solitude. So my wife and I in 2012 blacked out our house and did our first dark retreat together. We did 5 days together, and I was pretty touched by the experience and was like, I want to go dive in and have a solo experience. So I went back down to Baja, finished building this earthbag dome, and went in there for 10 days in the spring of 2013. And so that was my first introduction to darkness retreat. And
Wow.
I went in with a spiritual ego and my like superhero complex and spiritual warrior, and just like I can meditate 12, 14, 16 hours a day. I love being alone. Like this is, with my masculine kind of just conquest kind of thing. But probably not seeing it quite like that at the time. But there was an element of that and the exploration. And I went in and I was completely floored and humbled by how I didn't have what it took to really settle, to like genuinely
Mm.
feel settled. I had amazing managing mechanisms. I could meditate for a
Ah.
long period of time. I could stay afloat, and I probably didn't totally see that I was not totally settled. Now, if I had the support of somebody on the outside who had the experience to kind of notice what's happening and read between the lines,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know if I was humble enough at that time to be able to see, because it's quite devastating as like one exposes their sense of power and purpose to really just be manufactured and not really emerging from a settled space.
Yeah.
And so I was touched by the level of sensitivity that I had in there, like how deeply I could feel in my body.
Mm.
And I was also, my sincerity carried me enough where I was like, this is really challenging. I don't know why, because I've spent over 2 years in solitude alone out in the mountains. And so, like, I had ideas of why, but it moved me so much that I was like, I want to build a dark retreat. And I thought maybe I might be able to convince a few friends to like do it. I didn't. So then in 2017, we landed here in Southern Oregon. And in 2018, we started building our first dark retreat. And my family and my wife were not sure anyone would want to go into the dark. And
Okay.
so my like agreement when I was building this was that I'd build it with windows, our first one. We'd build it with windows, and then I'd black them out. We'd put skylights, I'd black them out. And if it just like no one wanted to get in the dark, then we'd just pull it off and we'd have this little cabin that we could go
Airbnb
to
time.
and rent. That was it. And we started it on Airbnb like 2020, like in the early spring, I was just like, I mean, we have the Dark Retreat website, but let's also put it on Airbnb because I don't really know. And pretty quickly, within the first couple months, there was Kyle Cease, who was
Yep.
yep, he's down in LA, spiritual teacher, comedian. He came, did a dark retreat, and he was just like, "You're going to be booked out for a long time now." And he left, and we were booked out. And then it just like from there, starting in 2020, all the way till now, a year and a half. And then the next year, we decided to build a couple more, and so now we have three that are continuously in use. And so that was, and then from then, I would go into the dark every year. The first 3 years, I went in for 10 days. And
Okay.
then after I started watching so many people come through the dark and witnessing the arc and beginning to see other people's experience, because all I had was mine.
Yep.
And in those early days, I saw everyone's through my lens, which was
Yeah.
like if somebody was like the way that I was, the only way I was able to gauge other people's experience was from where I was at and what I could be aware of and how I defined spiritual success or, all those kind of funny things that I had and still have in different subtle ways. I mean, being human, we have a lens that we perceive and like internalize through. And so in those early days, there wasn't that much support. People would go in, there'd be a little conversation. I'd bring the food and then they'd come out on their own. And as I talked to people as they were coming out, it was almost like the people who didn't have that hard of a time and were really able to just be in there and was like, this was great. I was just like, oh, wow, they're really in my mind. It was like there was some level that I assigned to some degree of spiritual evolution that they were able to
Mm.
be in there and all these things. And I'll unpack that more. Now, those tend to be the people who are really advanced at managing their experience, the much more masculine approach of like controlling, hovering, insulating in some way, but it's unconscious. And so they don't really notice that that's happening unless there's a level of sincerity and some experience support that can bring them back to the body and, if desired, point. So there's a little bit of exposure and somebody could kind of tune in for themselves and decide, like, am I on some level attempting to achieve spirituality, fix, heal, and awaken? Or am I genuinely softening, opening, and tending to what is arising in me, not for any hope of gain, not so I have anything to show for myself or tell about my experience, not because I want it to change, but because I genuinely want to be honest with what's here. And that's it. Like if that was one's sole movement, not because they're going to get to do great things in the world or they're going to like, it's just to be honest with what's here. And that really simplifies everything. And so
Yeah.
witnessing people go through the dark, it was through my lens in those early days. And then it probably would have stayed that way. But the only other person now who holds the container with me is Adrian. And I'd say now the orientation that we have here in the movement and the way and what I'm able to see is because of her. It's completely brought the feminine into the orientation and the lens, and so it's changed everything. Adrian joined 2 years ago. I'd known her for about 15 years. She does kind of her um, part of her foundation is somatic therapy, cranial sacral, and then she has her own decades of being on retreat and really deepening into her uncovered truth. And
Yeah.
so she came in, and Adrian does sessions with people before and after they go into the dark. So people
Mm.
they arrive just arbitrary. They arrive on a Monday afternoon. They just kind of get oriented in the space. They tend to go into the dark Monday night. And some people weave in and out of the dark. They come out Tuesday morning, or they stay in all the way till their session with Adrian. And then Tuesday afternoon, sometime Adrian comes up and there's a 2 hour somatic oriented session that really prepares people for their time in the dark. And then
Yeah.
Tuesday night, they go into the dark. It tends to be now 3 days, 4 nights. So Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they'd emerge Saturday morning. They have another 2 hour integration somatic oriented session, and then they would leave the next day morning. And so in the early days, I'd bring people out of the dark and I'd be with them the whole time. And people would come out and have such profound emotional openings, and they'd talk about the revelations that they had. I'd share with Adrian, and she's got like this person, they had such a profound experience. It was so powerful, all this. And then she'd have her session and come down, and I'd go back up and chat with the person and hear about their session. And it wasn't what I was seeing. It was like when they actually got into it and settled with another nervous system, they were able to actually confront what they weren't able to be in. So, like, all the
Mm.
undigested stuff was there. And what we then began to see, which, well, Adrian began to see, pointed it out to me, and then I could begin to see it, was that people were in so much relief when they were coming out, that the emotion is just like being rescued in the desert after like 4 or 5 days. There's just like so much joy. And then in that moment, you're seeing your experience through the lens of gratitude, because, and it's real.
Yeah.
And there's also, it's not necessarily settled. Now, that wasn't everybody, but there was enough times that it
Mm.
started to be like, huh. And then through that, there was an evolution of being with people differently, asking different questions, offering different explorations, because what was naturally happening is in our life is so overwhelming.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily feel safe in the world. Even if we're out in nature, there's a part of us that like could get attacked by an animal, or
Yep.
somebody's, other bugs are making us uncomfortable and we're unsettled. Like, whatever it is, we're not genuinely, authentically settled and feeling safe. Now, men tend to feel more safe in the world, but there's an element of being insulated in their sense of power that makes them feel safe. But how genuinely settled in like a vulnerable, exposed way is that safety? And so
Yeah.
we then began orienting with people differently and seeing that, just like in the world, people in the dark were doing things to feel safe, which is totally just part of being human, and so nothing wrong with that. And it was unconscious in that they weren't really aware that there was some element of managing the experience. And
Yeah.
as I began to witness that in others, I then also began to witness that in me. And it then had me moving in the dark differently, as I was then questioning how authentic my movement was in the dark, as I had a real great ability to still my mind and I could rest in the spaciousness and in the silence for hours and hours. And yet, as I have unpacked that more, it was like a mechanism that I had developed, a really maybe evolved way of managing myself. But then I could see how it almost made me emotionally flat. Like,
Yes.
and I've kind of seen it from just a handful of really evolved mindset people maybe who have come here, like, and not that there's, it's just that this curious exploration of, they tend to be really, or maybe really advanced meditators, where there's like, it's just all good. It lacks there's just not much emotion. And so one just questions, like, is it it's calm, but is it somehow cut off because of the
Yes.
orientation of how they're in there? And so just a curious exploration. And so for myself, it really started to change. And then I stopped doing 10 days in the dark because I saw so many people go through who are having these profound awakenings, who were the depth at which they touched was so curious to me, as like mine tended to, it was deep but it was just different. And so I was wondering, like, when some and witnessing a bunch of people do long dark retreats, of like, there's some element of overwhelm that comes in for everybody. And the longer someone's in the dark for, unconsciously, there's more overwhelm because it's like, whoa, I've got to be in this for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days. And so I was wondering for myself too, was that unconsciously influencing me, that had my managers, my meditators, but also my managers come online more, that helped me kind of like keep it all together, because it was like, that's a lot of time to be in there. And so my process started to change. And then more recently, as this whole thing continues to evolve, as we learn so much from each person that comes through here, is Adrian began to point out the level at which almost everyone was in fear in some way
Mm.
while they're in the dark. And then that really changed a lot of how we were with people, as it became clear that some people were maybe in a fear survival response the entire time,
Yeah.
but they were really good at managing their experience, that they weren't necessarily even aware that they were feeling that they were anxious. Once we began to see that, then there was questions and ways that we could be with people that would point them to, like, but what's really going on? Like, if you stopped doing that, what would happen? And they'd be like, whoa, well, like, I feel this crazy sensation in my hips and I feel really anxious. But they weren't even aware that they were anxious before. They were just like, it was something else. And it was just unable to see because of the overwhelm of feeling that. And so
Yeah.
now, one of the things that Adrian shares with people before they go in the dark is how to recognize if you're in a survival response, if you're in fight,
Mm.
if you're in flight, if you're in freeze. And one day I heard her sharing with somebody about how to recognize if they were in freeze, and that you're like leaned back, there's a sense of cold, you're pretty flat, and you tend to not want to walk around the room, that like you find
Mm.
your spot and you're just cozy there. And like all of a sudden it was like I got hit over the head, where I was like, that's totally me. I've always just, in the 50, 60 days of going into the dark prior, I've always just stayed in my bed.
Yeah.
But I put it through my lens of like, that's where I feel the safest. I like to lay down so that I can disarm myself and rest. And I did remember times of walking around the room and feeling unsettled. And yet I would just do the things I had to do and get back into bed. And I just chalked it up that like I just felt more comfortable in bed. And I never really turned towards like what was going on. And so it happened that I was going into the dark 2 weeks later. And when I went into the dark, I was definitely curious of like what
Mm.
happens if I start exploring other areas of the room. And at this point now, I had shortened my time in the dark to like 4 days, because I just hadn't seen from anyone that longer is ever deeper. It's really like 2, 3, and sometimes 4 days is plenty. And because there's an element in there that where people feel safe, because it's
Mhm.
not too long. And when somebody feels
Mhm.
safe, then they relax, and then they're not managing their experience, and then they can begin to tune in to what's already here. It's not like we need to create it. Our essence isn't something that we like manifest. Like
Mhm.
it's always with us. And so I then began exploring other parts of the room, realizing that I was maybe in some kind of more, I don't know, some form of advanced dissociation, where I was able to relax, be open, my mind was quiet, but there was some way that I was like flat. and insulated that had me feeling safe, that I was completely unaware of how that was happening. And so now I
Yeah.
started spending time in other parts of the room. And when I would sit in the middle of the room, which was the space in the room where I felt kind of least, the most unsafe, would sit there and my whole entire body would cave in. Like my heart would close and be like a rock. My whole entire chest would contract. My shoulders would come in, and it was like I was in a complete fear response. And
Yeah.
not no story. Like there was not even. It wasn't like preceded by a story. It was like it was the sensation first, and then it was like, holy shit, how do I like, and then I'd notice like immediately I'm going towards my breath to like, but then it's like, whoa, I'm trying to change this. I'm trying to
Yeah.
fix this. I'm managing my experience, and I'm like in a lot of pain, and like there is some level of, there's a lot of contraction. And
Yeah.
so in that moment, then for me there was an invitation to like, what would it feel like in my body to just rest and receive what's here. And so that was a new exploration for me. And that was just this last February. And so much
Wow.
that we are constantly, the offering and how we're with people is constantly evolving and refining as we see more and see more in ourselves.
Bro, I am like I just I have to pause you for a minute. Like I'm in awe of your depth and your articulation. Like you just articulated the last 3 days of me in nature with 50 men. Like
Mm,
to a T. And the part that like tickled me the most is feeling safe without ever really feeling safe. Like that level of like having that wall up because I was just with 50 men and my it's my friend's container and I dropped in as a participant and it was the first time like there was one practice in particular where I actually had 4 men hold me like a baby and
mm,
it was the first time like I can have any recollection of ever feeling like I could just close my eyes and disappear and I'd be safe forever. Like nothing can get to me. Like I'm in their arms in this container in the middle of nowhere with no phones. Like there was no threat anywhere around. And it was that moment that I felt that I realized how much I was managing my experiences. Like I've done the work for so long. I've done breath work so much. And so that moment like collapsed the previous like day and a half of like boom, and then that's where that depth of like what I felt was grief, but really it was a surrender, like a full surrender. Like it just felt like Mother Earth, God, like pure divine love just overwhelmed me, and the only thing I could do was sob louder than I've ever screamed at the top of my lungs. And that was the moment that I described earlier, but like the way you articulated it, and like when I've gone into the dark and I haven't gone more than 2 days, that's the feeling that I got. But just like you, like I'm like, oh no, no, like I'm in my spot, right? Like here's my spot. Or I would get into my position, right? I'm like, oh, I'm comfortable here, right? Like I can settle here. And, even the last couple of days, I found that happening. And then we did a nonlinear movement practice, a feminine embodiment practice. And boy, oh boy, did I find that spot as a hiding spot about 700 times in an hour. And I'm like, again? Again? I'm like, no, no, move. Like, and like just finding the patterns. But also, dude, like, I could go re listen to just the first 30 minutes of this and apply it to every area of life, of business, of like self discovery. Like, there is so much depth at so many levels packed into what you just shared. Like I'm just eternally grateful for the way that you articulated that. It was art to me. Like I'm in awe of you right now. I just want to shut up and keep listening to you. And I'm going
thanks,
to in a
George.
minute, but like bro, like thank you for that. In that you actually mentioned something earlier, and it was in relationship to when you did it with your wife, right? You're like, it moved you, right? Like it moved you. Like, I would be curious to hear, like, like for me, it's funny because like my brain was thinking earlier, I'm like, oh yeah, we go into the dark to hide from people, thinking we can hide from ourselves, and it's the most light exposing place ever, right? But I love the no agenda. I love the surrender. I'm curious for you in that lens of like how you've related to your own experiences and emotions, like the depth of the discovery of your emotions in those moments, and then how it translates like coming out into the world.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so the uncovering of emotions, I mean, I guess before diving into that, to just complete the whole fear movement too, is like,
Oh yeah.
is, it's kind of like people are like, well, what would I be afraid of? I mean, some people are like, I'm afraid of the dark, but like, one of the curious things that happens in there is I'll go up and ask somebody, and not everyone responds this way, but like, do you feel safe? And people are like, yes. And but I could feel that that's not totally true, or how what they then go on to share about what they've done today and everything. It's a complete avoidant movement, which is totally fine because we're doing it all the time. There's nothing wrong with it. It's what's making them feel safe. But like right underneath that insular avoidant movement is a feeling of being unsettled. And so then it's like,
Mm,
but like, why? You're alone in a dark room and you're safe. And it's like, what what better of a thing to expose how safe we are than being completely safe, like in a container where even at your deepest animalistic level, that like you're contained and you're safe. And so that level of exposure of which then exposes the levels in us that don't feel safe. And then that, like, what is that though? It's almost like a resistance
yeah.
to the emotions that are there. And so one of the elements that, and this is more just in our exploration, is this really true, but it's kind of how we see it, is that we're always referencing our like where we are through our senses. Like we have a location in time and place, and you go into the dark and you lose that. And so at a deep animalistic level, you're almost kind of lost, and you're exposed and you're vulnerable, and you don't have your surroundings to reference, and you have no idea how long it's going to last because you lose all sense of time. And at a core level, that's horrifying. You just like, but at a mental level, you're like, I'm fine. And so there's this conflict that happens where like some people aren't able to actually connect, and especially men, with the level of fear that they're actually in, because we have great managing mechanisms, we insulate with power and purpose, and then also we just mentally know that we're safe, but that's just not enough. There is something in us that's scared. And then another thing is some people are able to touch into that fear, but everyone has a different nervous system and different trauma and different resources, that there's an element of overwhelm, that it's actually so overwhelming, the fear and the resistance that's there, that it's hard to actually settle. And that's where the co-regulation and the check-ins really help, is somebody can genuinely begin to have permission. And I've heard so many people share, they're like, I didn't even know that I needed permission to feel this way. Like how
Yeah.
much, as I mean, if we just use like just the generic gender roles, how much like a man does not have permission to feel fear and sadness. A woman doesn't
Yep.
have so much permission to feel anger. A man's
Yep.
got all the permission in the world to be angry because it really fills him with power, but a powerful woman is an entirely different thing.
Yeah.
And so just these elements of permission. And so that brings us like to the emotions of,
And one thing I want to add, because I said emotion, I also meant senses. My
aha,
brain was thinking senses and I
okay,
said emotion. And so
yep,
both would be amazing because I would love
yeah.
to hear about both.
So senses in what regard?
like I also remember earlier when you mentioned the tribe who sends the kids in with the mother for 7 to 9 years. I actually read about that years ago, and I was so intrigued, and I wrote really deep down that rabbit hole.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I was reading about was how it heightened all their other senses and attunements and awarenesses
Mm.
of,
Aha.
like their the sound,
Yeah.
the even like, like I have horses in front of me in pasture. Like horses can feel your heart from like 10, 15 yards away, right? Like it's this attunement to energy. And so like emotion and senses, I feel like you get a deeper understanding, but also maybe even a more powerful ability to utilize them.
Yeah, totally. So like the senses, I mean, one thing that happens in there pretty quickly for somebody who's, I mean, and like the experience is different for everyone because we have different degrees of managing our experience, the degrees to which we're insulated. And so there's an element of pressure for everyone. And some people maybe feel it for like a split second, and then the manager's online and they don't even realize the pressure that's there. I think that would have, I fit definitely in that category in my early days in dark, where I would have not really said that there was much pressure. I kind of chalked it up to my spiritual evolution. Now I think maybe more my spiritual dissociation, but um, the like so in that somebody comes into the dark and then all of a sudden the contents of their mind are everything because their other senses are gone, and so the only, and they're not orienting where they are within time and space and place. And so the one of the things that gets heightened is the mind, which is
Mm,
really difficult and also really exposing of like what is it that we're actually obsessing with, what's really most important. And like as we'd maybe want to say love and all these things, it's just like, but somehow our mind's focused on a million other things. And so like as someone's in the dark, that gets refined where they begin to really distill what matters most, and they begin to get honest with what matters most, because that's really where they begin to settle. And so another sense that, I mean, I'd say initially the sense that gets most heightened is one's thoughts, and
yeah.
that begins to create for some enough pressure that they are confronted in a way that has them moving to go manage the experience, achieve spirituality, fix, change, heal, and awaken. Or on the other end, it has them getting honest with what's moving in their body, settling, tending, and anchoring in the body. And then once that movement happens to anchor in the body, then the senses are heightened for feeling. Like the degree to which somebody can feel in their body, the degree to which somebody can feel subtlety in their body. And then there's so much stored in the body, things start to move. And if somebody can really settle in and be available and give themselves full permission to be in what's there without looking to have anything to show for themselves, without anything to gain, without wanting to get anywhere, just genuinely wanting to be honest with what's here. And it's a real authentic movement in them, then the emotions really start to move. And then as one sinks into it, there tends to be a lot of space between the waves. And so then there's all this stillness. And then another sense that comes online is the sounds of silence. Like how much there is in silence. Like silence has sounds. There's like bells, whistles, fuzz, static. I mean, just ways to describe the undescribable, but there is something in the silence. And then as people attune into that, the senses are heightened and then they can hear different frequencies that are there. And one of the, I mean, there's so many things that have totally turned my world upside down of witnessing people go into the dark. And one of them has been witnessing the people who genuinely settle in their body, connected, rested, settled. It is not because of any technique or years of breath work or years of meditation or vision quest or vision fast or plant medicine or anything that has allowed them to drop into that. And that completely blew my mind, where I'm like, what the hell have I been doing? I've been meditating up on the mountain for 20 years. And here's this person who has never meditated, never did breath work, never did plant medicine, never did therapy, never did anything, but had the real genuine qualities of curiosity, of simplicity, of tenderness, and of a real sincerity to be honest, and able to be nothing special with nothing to show for themselves. And that was enough to bring them into the depth of their body, connected and settled. And then from that, they would have hours of stillness. And it wasn't because they were managing their mind through like a meditation technique and focusing, it was them settling in their body. And once they were connected and authentic and settled in their body, their mind stilled on its own. And that completely blew my mind. It still completely blows my mind when somebody comes and that happens. And I'm still like, people spend a lifetime meditating and never get as much still. Like, you were just in stillness for hours and hours. People spend a lifetime meditating and never
Yep.
get that much stillness.
Yep.
And one common theme for people in that is they're all surprised. They're not like, look at I did, or I did it, or I had this. It's just like, whoa, like, look what happened. Like, I can't believe
Yes.
it. There's this shock and this awe because they didn't do it. It just happened.
Just
And
happened.
an element in that, within, you had kind of alluded to like integration, or how does it like play out
Yeah.
into the world, is when we're in this space of managing our experience and fixing, healing, transforming, awakening, achieving spirituality, and again, not that anything's wrong with any of that. It's just the following that thread of like, why, like, what is the movement? If there is a big movement, which I'm continually uncovering in myself, which was a big spiritual achiever, and still have so many subtle threads in it that I'm constantly uncovering, is like, underneath that, there's a felt sense of lack, a deep
Yeah.
lack. Like, if you're not feeling lack, then you're probably not going to have a strong need to achieve.
Mhm.
Like, you're just going to be able to rest, relax, settle, and you're just fine. But if you genuinely have lack, or a felt sense of lack, truly there is no lack when we really get into what is unbroken, but we still have lack, a felt sense of lack, which could then be, maybe underneath that is a sense of resistance because of what's there: pain, sadness, fear, anger, whatever it may be. So then there's resistance, then we feel lack or empty, and then there's this movement to achieve, there's this movement to like strive, fix, change, heal, awaken. And not that any of that is wrong, and some of the authentic, sincere movement in that is what propels us forward. And then if our sincerity is there and the moment's ripe and we feel safe enough, genuinely, then there's just the surrender, like you touched on, where we can really land in what's here without covering it through this movement of achieving.
Yeah.
And so that, I lost my thread of where I was. Um, yeah, I
It
went on
started
that.
it started it started around, well, I feel like you're healing my masculine even deeper than I did this weekend, because it was the lack of achievement and how people reach these states
Now,
without
right.
the work.
Yeah. And so that was, so in witnessing these people in this movement, where when there is not that striving and there is the resting and the settling, and the mind just quiets on its own, and there's not this, it wasn't because of necessarily prior experience, it was more about the orientation. And then also seeing that in people who have come like myself, and there's been a handful of others who have 10, 15, 20 years of like meditation, but it's kind of been a little bit in the orientation of managing, and like meditation in managing as opposed to maybe meditation in just opening and being with, and like for an element of settling into what's exposed, that those people in that managing, whether it's meditation or whatever it is, there's an insulated hovering.
Yeah.
And then another element that's been completely um, humbling for me is watching the feminine move in the dark. And women naturally tend to have more feminine energy. And so witnessing, like, I'm so deeply humbled watching women, witnessing women in the dark, of how accessible that space is, like how willing, and then how covered men tend to be, like how, I mean, and we have our culture and maybe like the animal in us that has that like protector, but then it gets like distorted to the conqueror, and then like the power, and like for a man to lay down his power and genuinely admit, I'm scared and I feel helpless, is like probably one of the most horrifying things a man could do. And like that is ultimately what's needed, at least in the dark, for someone to genuinely settle. And so that veil is a lot harder for a man to move through. With that said, there's tons of men that move through that, and plenty of women who are um, more in their masculine orientation, or, you know, so it's not so black and white, but it is the feminine that is able to soften in there and genuinely be with what's present. And then all of a sudden there's this crack. And then there's a genuine settledness in what's really here. And there's a couple women up there right now, and I was just reflecting this morning with Adrian of how deeply humbled I was to witness and be with these women, of like emotion freely, for me, emotion freely moving is more of a newer experience, as from how covered and managed I was and insulated in a sense of power and purpose. And so witnessing, for even just right now, these women, of just how the emotion, how freely the emotion moves through without a story, and then the wave moves and they're just back settled in like a genuine, open, vulnerable, settled sense of nurture and connectivity. And that there are plenty of men who come, and that's the space that they land in when they genuinely settle. There's no sense of being like puffed up, I got it, it's
Yep.
this great experience, it's amazing, whenever, like it's just not. It's amazing in the sense of like how simple it is and how nurturing it is and how tender it is, but not in the sense of like it's just not a peak experience, and it's nothing that really puffs us up. And so
Yeah.
yeah, just witnessing that movement in to simplicity and into softness.
God, I could hear you talk about this all day. Like I genuinely like feel like I just received a gift for 55 minutes of, and maybe it's because I just walked out of practice, but like genuinely, like you just articulated like every ounce of the last 3 days of my experience, but like every ounce of the last 15 years of me and the work on working on healing myself, and with such ease and grace and meticulousness. And like I'm like, I want a cave at my house now. Like I just want one at my house because like this is incredible. And
I actually, for everybody listening, there's questions that you might have pop in your head like, well, how do I eat? How do I drink? How do I do all that? The reason I haven't asked about any of those is because their website is one of my favorite places to hang out. And I'm going to tell you, like, genuinely, go to the story section and watch people's interviews when they come out of the dark. And my favorite ones are the ones I see of the kids. When you have like the kids come out that come in, because we've talked to our kids about it, and my wife is a big fan as well. And for everybody listening, I'm just going to give you their website now. It's skycaveretreats.com, skycaveretreats.com. But I've watched every one of those because I'm like, I want to know what they say. I want to know what they feel. I want to know. And it's so beautiful to see the way that people articulate what you just articulated. And I also like, brother, I just feel called to say thank you for being like a humbled servant, like a just true, like humbled leader in how you speak about this and talk about this. Like, I know why that container feels so safe. Like, just even how you articulate about the experience and those women that are in it make me want to send everybody and me want to come in, just because of the care and the integrity that you bring to the work that you do, and plus like your path in of like truly wanting to gift the world and gift people experiences that you had, but also constantly being humbled and evolving yourself and knowing there's never a finish line. Like it like, I'm genuinely humbled by you, brother, like at a very, very deep level. I just want to say thank you so much. And like, I have a question for you before we end the show, but like, I just wanted to take a minute while we're still in it, like just to express my utmost gratitude. Like, I just feel so honored that you shared that time with me today and with us, because like it really, really is an honor.
Mm. Thanks, George.
Yeah,
It's a
man.
pleasure
Like
to share in it.
I'm like I would sit in front of you by a fire or on a floor and just listen to you talk to me about this all day. Like it's it's full embodiment, right? Like it's full embodiment of the work, and even the choice of your words. But it's the um, it's the humility that gets me. It's the full integration of your masculine and feminine, and your ability to modulate between both with no pride and no ego, and deliver it from a place of service that like literally tickles my heart at
Mm.
such a deep level, to have me feel so safe on my own podcast. And like, I don't want to speak at all. I just want to listen to you. And so I don't know if that gets reflected to you at all, but I felt called in my heart to share that with you. And so I genuinely thank you.
Mm. Thanks, George.
Yeah, yeah, of course. For everybody listening, I kind of led the horse a little bit here, but um, I've been a fan of theirs because so many of my friends have come to your spot, Stephanos and Hannah, and Aaron Alexander, Mr. Movement King, like everybody who's come up there, and I genuinely love your social. But I feel like I have a small version of what you get to experience, is being there when they come out and getting to experience and witness somebody in their clarity and in that depth, and that you share so much of that so well. So for everybody listening, like, whether you're interested or not, whether you've looked or not, I promise you, the level of wisdom that you can even find in hearing people's clarity in these videos, like darkness delivered me into profound simplicity. You get to see who you are in your nakedness, like a beautiful invitation to be as simply as I am, as my friend Caitlin put up there, right? Like, there's so many nuggets of wisdom that you can find. And so I actually have a two-part question to wrap the show. There's so many things that you spoke about, and so many parts that can be found in the darkness. And for people that, like, let's say they even want to come up to you knowing there's like a waiting list and time, like, question one is, what are some things or ways to even start thinking about this potentially, like, that could serve them today, whether it's connecting with their emotions in their body, or using stillness, or any of those things, because you articulated it all so well. And then my second part of the question is, I'm going to mix this into the same one, is I always like to ask people at the end of the show, if you imagine that everybody listening forgot everything you said for the first hour, and you were able to leave them with one piece of wisdom to tattoo on their soul, what would that be? And if you want to combine them together, you can, but I felt called to ask you both.
Yeah, beautiful. Um, yeah, I mean, before I answer that, you mentioned Caitlin, who's, she has a longer, in the story section on our site, there's like a longer form interview with her. And, she was just one example for me that completely, I was so humbled to be with Caitlin and she shares about it, like the waves that she moved through, where like I almost felt like, I mean, not totally, not like inferior, but almost just like just so taken by the feminine's ability to just allow emotion to move through, and like, and what Caitlin touched, like without shame, without just like including all of it, and the settledness that came from that, where it wasn't like an insulated safety that is somehow flat or has some emotion move in it, but it's also insulated in purpose and power. Like this totally exposed, vulnerable flow and emotion was just so humbling and touching. And you just mentioned Caitlin, and it made me think of that for a moment.
Yeah.
And then to touch on your question, but to also, I missed integration, and that was where I was going at one point, was like, because it's not a peak experience, it's like when we have a peak experience or we see something and the freaking floodgates blow open, and then we go to integrate it, there's a part of us that's trying to replicate that experience. And then almost underneath that is a part of us that doesn't feel whole. And we're trying to get back to this space, even though there is a natural movement in us to want to feel great and like it felt meaningful and really important. And yet now this movement to get back there to replicate it or integrate it is like almost this movement of looking away from where we actually honestly are. And so in the dark, where it's not a peak experience, we're not oriented towards achieving greatness, or we're moving towards being honest. And so as one settles in the dark, the whole movement in there is, it's not about what's happening, it's about your relationship to what's happening. It's about the quality of your honesty and connection to what's happening. And so the whole movement in the dark is about integrating. Like that is the whole thing, is including more, is welcoming more, is receiving more. And so then one leaves the dark, and one is not going to stay in the states that they got into, because they're no longer in the dark and we get back into the busyness of the world. But if one really lands in that fundamental movement, it's to include more. And so in that movement to include more, there's not this resistance, this unconscious bracing and manufacturing of how we feel like we need to be. There's the movement to include and settle and welcome what's genuinely here. And so to circle back to your last question of kind of the preparing, how does someone get into that? And then like one last nugget, if somebody forgot everything.
Yeah.
In the preparation for the dark, Adrian's in the process of creating like an 8 to 10 week prep course that people will then really be able to, it's almost like a process in pre-exposing, like, because that's what happens in the dark is you're so exposed, and then on some level you look away because it would be humiliating or shame, or it would cut you down too much, or just it also can be really overwhelming and scary, all these things mixed in of why we may look away. And so this process of getting familiar with what it's like to be exposed. And so one way or a couple ways of preparing, one is just like laying down, whether it's on the earth, in your house, on the floor, on your bed, whatever it is, and you're just like, what does it feel like to lay down inside in your body and rest and receive. And that's all. Not with any hope of gain, not with like anything to come out and show for yourself, not even to necessarily get into a calm, joyous space. It's just to make contact with what's here, which may be sorrow, pain, anger, whatever it is. It's just to settle, connect, rest, and receive. And so that being a way that we can start to get familiar with what is it like when we totally lay down our sword, we also lay down our shield, and we're just rested. And then another exploration is uh, also whether someone's planning to come to the dark or not, but like, what is it that genuinely drives us? And like, and then why? Like, this thing drives us, and like, why does it drive us? And once we've received that, once we got that thing, what is it that it gives us? Like, what drives you and why? What does it give to you? And this is a question in a different way that I ask people in the dark when we have the check-ins morning and evening, as like, it gets refined and distilled down to like what we're ultimately wanting is connection. I mean, and peak experiences bring a lot of connection because they're so full, we're so connected, but it's not, it's like, if we let go, we don't necessarily want the peak experience, we want the connection, where that's where the meaning really comes from. And so that movement in the dark, where we're not looking for a certain kind of experience, and we're not looking to the way we are in the world, we're looking to the quality of our connection. It really flips the script on everything of how we lean in. And so that another pre-exposing exploration is like, what drives you? Why? What does it bring to you? And to use your own words, which become important so people can really, it really comes from the inside of like, what does that give you? Like, what is that quality that's most meaningful to you? And then what would it look like to lean into that? To just simply be with that, whether it's connection or intimacy or acceptance or love. Like, what happens when you just lay down within and just allow that quality to be present alongside with whatever else may be there. And
Wow.
so if somebody forgot everything that was said and there was one last thing that one was really with, what comes to mind right now is something that the Zen master Suzuki Roshi used to say, is the most important thing is remembering the most important thing.
Wow. That is the best bow to put on this entire episode. You just landed it like 100 out of 100 with that one, my friend. Holy moly. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah. The most important thing is to remember the most important thing.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That brings me right back into where I belong. Wow. Thank you for that. And for everybody listening, I'm going to keep this outro short because I don't want to dissipate any of that power or any of the juju that was here. And so here's what I would recommend. No matter what, connect with Sky Cave Retreats somewhere. Instagram, same handle, skycaveretreats.com. Even if you just see the clips as a reminder to lay in bed, to ask how you receive, to start feeling into your body, even in the light, it's always going to be an invitation. And the fortune cookie at the end of the most important thing to remember is why this work exists. And it's going to be profound and powerful. And I highly, highly recommend it. And so, Scott, from the bottom of my heart, brother, I'm sure I will reach out and be like, can we do that again and go for round 2? And just for now, like, just even knowing that there are incredible women in the hill behind you and you're there facilitating and being in the work and sharing your wisdom with us and your presence with us, and for everybody listening, like, just utmost gratitude, brother.
Thanks, George. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, brother, I feel the same. I feel like my life just got drastically better today, and that you poured into my bucket. And so, thank you. And for everybody listening to this, this would be one of those episodes that I would take slow and intentional and meticulous. This isn't a drive in the car episode, maybe for the first time. This is a sit down with some space episode. Maybe even invite yourself to sit in the darkness and listen to it. Darken your room. Just sit in a space and be intentional with this one, because there are levels of wisdom and depth in this episode, and I will be pulling notes out of this one for myself personally for a long time to come. And so, with that, just to make sure, everything will be linked in the show notes. Their Instagram will be in the show notes. The website will be in the show notes. And I just highly encourage you, even if you got anything out of this episode, just to DM them on Instagram and just say thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for doing the work. Thank you for being so profound. And then let's add some more light and love into Scott and Sky Cave Retreats and Adrian's bucket to help them keep impacting the world as positive as they are, because they have a big vision, doing a lot of research, and have a big plan to help humanity through the work that they're doing. And I'm a big supporter, and I love all of it. And so for that, I got to save my voice, because this beautiful man just filled so much space with so much love and joy. And so with that, we're going to wrap today's show. So you will either see me in the next episode, or you will hear me with some version of this voice in your earballs. But either way, we're out.